let's dig deep into it a little bit more. I'm looking at the different chapters that you have in the Black tax here,
Yep.
and you specifically lay out the different ways that we are taxed as Black Americans, and really Black people worldwide. You know, it goes beyond America,
Mm-hmm.
or the United States, as to say. You know, can you just talk about, you know, through discrimination, what are the different ways that we're taxed, and what is the underlying economic impact that having those additional taxes has on our community?
Yeah, so great question, big question. So one of the things that I do in the book, because I try to approach this whole thing differently than kind of most people do, right? I start to talk about like, where is it coming from? And what's driving this is the what I call, or what researchers call, anti-Black bias, right? Now that's coming through two different modes. The first mode is conscious. People know exactly what they're doing, right? When it comes to how they deploy their bias. And then the other portion of it is the unconscious level of it. So in the book, I talk about what those levels are in the country. So when you're looking kind of in aggregate, when you talk about, you know, conscious bias, people know exactly what they're doing. It's almost like 5 and 10. It's above 50% of the population. When you're talking about the subconscious bias or the implicit bias, we're talking almost 6 and 10 on average. And if you look at some of the work that Harvard's done, they have something called the implicit association test, where they measure, right, unconscious bias against Black people. They call it automatic white preference, right? So a really nice way of saying anti-Black bias, right? They have over 33.4 million people have taken that online test. And their numbers say we're talking about 7 and 10, 8 and 10, right? Of Americans that have taken that test have this automatic white preference or anti-Black bias. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was gonna talk about that a little bit more. So, you know, that test, you know, talks about in terms of bias. Are you Black bias? Are you white bias? You know, in terms of the association. So, are you saying that about 70 or 80% of the people are biased towards whiteness versus biased towards Blackness?
Yes. So
Okay.
the way they describe it is an automatic white preference, right? And they're measuring that. So they have different tests, but they started with the racial bias associated with it. And that's the one that most people have taken. And that's the one that I'm talking about very, very specifically. So that's an automatic white preference. And they take you through several different tests, right? And it's really interesting to see how they and others measure this kind of implicit bias, right? Because it's beyond our ability to know what we are doing and what we're thinking. But my point, and what's really interesting, is how high it is, right? These are extraordinarily high levels. So even if you're talking between 6 and 10 and 8 and 10, depending on which kind of research that you're looking at, those are mind-boggling high levels. So my thought was, okay, I get that. You can ask the so what question. The issue is, to what extent does that show up in the marketplace, right? And as it shows up, is there a cost to it? Because that's the net that we all got to get to. So I kind of introduced that so that people have some context to what's going on here, and we're not seeing and thinking about things in a vacuum, right? So the issue becomes, you know, how is that showing up? And I think, like, you've heard about, you know, the tests that were done, the research that was done on just putting names on a resume, for example, right? So what they would do is they would create these kind of mock resumes. They would vary the resumes in terms of quality, length of experience, you know, the quality of the institution that you went to, the depth of the experience. And they would just change the name from what appeared to be a white sounding name versus a Black sounding name, sent out thousands of these resumes, and then collected data on what they were seeing. And some of the things that they were seeing was you know, if it was a Black sounding name, it was 50% less callbacks, right? So you're not even getting a chance to tell your story about how you could be a great addition to the company and what you could do and all that. 50% just on name, right? That's the only thing, the perception, right, from this name that you may be Black. The other piece of it is what they found, that as you increase the quality of the resume, right, the institution, depth of experience, length of experience, you got like a 30% increase in callbacks. Makes terrific sense, stronger candidate, right? But as they increase the quality for Black sounding names, no statistical difference. Zero increase in demand, right?
Wow.
And so this is significant, because You're investing in the quality of your background and performance, but then you're not seeing the return, right? You know, people would say, well, maybe that's just for regular folks, right? Some of these really high-end fields, people tend to be less discriminatory, they're more objective. These things don't happen. So when you start to look at some studies that were done on lawyers, right? So you're talking about some of the, you know, best educated, most articulate, right? Hardworking people, very, you know, high salaries, right? Creme de la creme is fantastic. They created a legal memo, right? And they purposely built errors into these legal memos, right? And what they did was they sent it out to a number of partners at law firms, same memo, different groups of partners. One set of partners, they said, you know, this was written by a Black legal associate. And the other one they said was written by a white legal associate. Here's part of the challenge, right? So for the partners that thought it was written by a Black person, they gave a much lower grade, right? So you would get a 4 out of 5 if they thought it was written by a Black person, and a 3.1 out of 5 if they thought it was a white person. So 4 to 5 is about 80%. Not super amazing, but there's 22 errors in these memos, right? Significant errors. So you're getting a failing grade if they think it's written by a Black person, right? But you're getting, you know, pretty good marks for something that's flawed if they think it's a white person. And the problem here is, and they had lower expectations of the quality of the future that the person would have, right? Based on the same exact memo. Nothing's different, but who they thought wrote it. And my position from that was, that has implications on those attorneys who have the same capabilities getting on a path to partner, right? If you're making that judgment about one person and not making a judgment about another person, it might be more difficult for you to get the assignments that are necessary, right? So you get the partnership and the sponsorship with the right folks at the firm. It might be difficult for you to get on those really choice projects that gets you on a path to partner. Now, while you can live a nice life and not become a partner, when you start talking about career earnings between being a partner and not a partner, you're talking about over $11 million over a career.
Wow.
It's impact, right? So at the end of the day, there's a financial implication. And then if you start thinking about what's the impact on that person's family, what's the impact on that person's community, what's the impact of all the nonprofit boards that these people tend to sit on, what's the impact on the churches and the houses of worships that they tend to be a part of, you start to see a massive ripple effect, right, across the community for people who have it's the same exact material, but they're coming to vastly different conclusions about the capabilities of people, right? So, and that's you know, that's something that's really, really problematic. And not only do you see it there, but even in online commerce. There was a study that was done on eBay, and it was really clever. They were using baseball cards, and they said, well, they're gonna sell baseball cards online, and they're gonna see if there's any kind of differential reaction versus if people thought it was Black or white. And what they saw was a substantial difference in pricing, right? Between 20 and 35% in pricing, what people were willing to pay for the same baseball card, depending on if the person was Black or white. Now, you might ask the question, well, how would you know? It's just the baseball card, right? But what they did was they took a picture of the baseball card, and in the picture, you could see the tips of the finger of the person who was holding it.
Interesting.
So the tips of your finger, you could see the melanin content. That allowed the bias to be triggered. And that led to a massive differential in pricing, right? Very few businesses can take a 20, 35% swing on a top line impact, right? So the issue is there's pretty significant biases out there, both conscious, people know what they're doing, and subconscious, they don't mean to, but there is an impact, and the impact is also has a financial impact, right? And that is why, you know, it's called the Black tax, because at the end of the day, it's a reduction to cash flow. And if it's a reduction to cash flow, it's a reduction to ownership, and it's a reduction to your legacy.
Right. And, that makes a lot of sense in terms of it being the reduction of your cash flow, because every time you're taxed is less money that you could spend investing in something else or some type of opportunity cost that's associated with that tax. And, in the book, you mentioned the real estate market. I'm sure you have examples for that, the automotive market, insurance, online commerce that you just mentioned, your labor, so job searching and, after you get the job, financing, so many different ways in which we are taxed, as Black people, based on this concept of really is brand perception and the brand value of whiteness versus the brand liability in terms of asset or liability for Blackness in America, right?
Yep.
And the first person I heard ever talk about that is Dr. Claude Anderson in the book Powernomics. He talked about the brand value of whiteness and how that holds a lot of weight because of the psychological preferences that people have that have been built up over generations.
That's right.
Something that was interesting about the implicit bias test is, the test didn't measure in terms of how many people were biased towards whiteness. It measured how many people were biased towards whiteness versus biased towards Blackness, right? In terms of what is their racial bias. And there are a lot of Black people, maybe even a majority, I can't remember the exact numbers, that were also biased towards, whatever is white is right, type of mindset too. And they don't know that because it's unconscious.
That's exactly right.
Something that has been ingrained in us since we were born, in terms of, music and songs and just culture in general, in terms of, how, Black people are portrayed in the media versus whites and in just in everyday life at the same time.